When Ethan hit me, I was the aggressive older sibling. When he broke my things, I didn't know how to share. I was always at fault, until I recorded one of our fights on my phone. Growing up in our house felt like living in an upside-down world where logic didn't exist. Ethan was 3 years younger than me, but somehow he had mastered the art of emotional manipulation better than most adults I knew. Every single day brought a new performance, and I was always cast as the villain in his carefully orchestrated dramas. The morning routine was always the same nightmare. I'd wake up early to get ready for school only to find my homework torn up and scattered across the floor. Ethan would be sitting at the breakfast table, innocent as an angel, spooning cereal into his mouth while our parents rushed around getting ready for work. When I'd confront him about my destroyed assignment, he'd put on this wounded expression that could win an Oscar. The tears would start immediately. Big, dramatic sobs that echoed through our kitchen while he pointed at me with a shaking finger. Our mom would drop everything and rush to comfort him, shooting me disappointed looks over his head. Dad would sigh heavily and deliver the lecture I knew by heart about being responsible for my belongings and not accusing my little brother without proof. But the proof was right there in the torn pages, in the crayon marks that matched the ones he'd been using the night before. None of that mattered, though. What mattered was that Ethan was crying, and somehow that automatically made me the bad guy. I'd have to scramble to rewrite my assignment during lunch break while my classmates played outside, my stomach growling because I'd missed breakfast dealing with the morning crisis. The physical confrontations were even worse. Ethan had this calculated way of picking fights when our parents were just out of earshot. He'd wait until they were in the next room, then start poking me, pulling my hair, or punching my arm. His hits weren't playful taps either. They were hard enough to leave bruises, strategic enough to hit spots that would hurt but wouldn't show. I tried ignoring him at first, the way all the parenting books probably suggested. But when you're getting your ribs jabbed while trying to watch TV after a long day at school, patience runs thin pretty quickly. Eventually, I'd snap and push him away or grab his wrist to stop him from hitting me again. That's when the real show would begin. The transformation was instant and terrifying. The moment I touched him, even in self-defense, Ethan would let out this blood-curdling scream that could probably wake the neighbors 3 houses down. He'd throw himself on the floor, clutching whatever body part I'd supposedly injured, wailing about how much it hurt. By the time our parents came running, I'd be standing there looking guilty while he writhed on the ground like I'd broken every bone in his body. The conversations that followed were always identical. Mom would scoop Ethan up, checking him over for injuries that never existed, while Dad would pull me aside for another lecture about being the older sibling. The words became a broken record playing in my head. You need to be more responsible. You're bigger than him. You should know better. Family is everything. Learn to forgive. The forgiveness part was the cruelest joke of all. I was expected to apologize not just for defending myself, but for causing the entire situation in the first place. According to the twisted logic of our household, if I had just let Ethan hit me without responding, none of it would have happened. The fact that I was the one with actual bruises while he didn't have a scratch on him never seemed to factor into their judgment. School became my only escape from the madness at home. During those blessed hours between 8 and 3, I could pretend I was just a normal kid with normal problems. I threw myself into my studies, partly because I genuinely enjoyed learning, but mostly because it gave me something to focus on besides the unfairness waiting for me at home. But even school wasn't completely safe from Ethan's influence. He had a talent for destroying my projects right before they were due, or hiding my supplies so I'd have to explain to teachers why I wasn't prepared. The worst incident happened during my sophomore year when I'd spent weeks working on a science fair project about solar energy. I'd built this elaborate model with tiny solar panels and LED lights, staying up late every night perfecting the details. The morning of the science fair, I found my project smashed to pieces in the garage. Ethan claimed he'd been playing with his soccer ball and accidentally knocked it over, but the damage was too systematic, too thorough to be accidental. Every solar panel had been deliberately crushed, every wire carefully pulled apart. It would have taken dedicated effort to cause that much destruction. When I showed our parents the ruins of my project, their response was predictably disappointing. Instead of being outraged on my behalf, they seemed more concerned about not making Ethan feel bad about his accident. They suggested I could build something simpler for the fair, maybe just a poster or a basic experiment. The months of work I'd put in, the excitement I'd felt about competing, none of that seemed to matter compared to protecting Ethan's feelings. That was the day something inside me started to harden. I realized that no matter what Ethan did to me, no matter how obvious his lies or how cruel his behavior, our parents would always find a way to excuse it. I was living in a house where justice didn't exist, where being older somehow made me responsible for every conflict regardless of who actually started it. The emotional toll of constantly being blamed for things I didn't do started affecting every aspect of my life. I became anxious and withdrawn, never sure when the next manufactured crisis would emerge. Simple interactions with Ethan felt like walking through a minefield, knowing that any reaction I had could be twisted into evidence of my supposed aggression. Friends at school started noticing changes in my behavior. I became hyper-vigilant about fairness, unable to let even small injustices slide because I dealt with such massive ones at home. Group projects became sources of stress because I was terrified someone might blame me for problems I hadn't caused. The constant invalidation at home had rewired my brain to expect accusation and punishment even when I'd done nothing wrong. The lies Ethan told about me grew more elaborate and damaging as we got older. He'd claim I'd threatened him when our parents weren't around or that I'd broken something valuable and tried to frame him for it. The stories were always just plausible enough that our parents couldn't dismiss them entirely, but creative enough to paint me as some kind of manipulative mastermind. One particularly awful incident happened during Christmas break when I was 17. Ethan had gotten a new gaming system as a present, and I'd asked if I could try it out for a few minutes. He said yes initially, but then changed his mind after I'd already started playing. Instead of just asking me to stop, he started pulling on the controller while I was holding it. The controller slipped from both our hands and hit the TV screen, creating a spider web of cracks across the display. Before I could even process what had happened, Ethan was already running to our parents, sobbing about how I'd thrown the controller at the TV in a rage when he asked me to share. The fact that his fingerprints were on the controller too, or that throwing it wouldn't have created that particular pattern of damage, didn't matter to anyone but me. That Christmas was ruined by hours of lectures about respecting other people's property and controlling my temper. I had to use money from my part-time job to pay for a replacement TV, while Ethan got sympathy and a promise that his gaming system would be kept somewhere safe from my apparent violent tendencies. The injustice of it burned in my chest like acid, but I'd learned by then that protesting would only make things worse. Living under constant false accusations started to mess with my sense of reality. I began second-guessing my own memories, wondering if maybe I really was as awful as everyone seemed to think. The gaslighting was so consistent and came from people who were supposed to love and protect me, making it hard to trust my own perceptions of events. Update 1. By the time I turned 18, I felt like I was losing my mind. The pattern had continued for so many years that I'd started to wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Maybe I really was the problem. Maybe I was remembering things differently than they actually happened. The self-doubt was eating me alive, making me question every interaction and second-guess every memory. Then something happened that changed everything. Ethan had just turned 15, and his manipulative skills had reached professional levels. He'd learned to vary his tactics, sometimes playing the victim, sometimes acting like the wise younger brother trying to help his troubled older sibling. The performance was so convincing that even I sometimes caught myself believing his version of events. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was home alone with Ethan, trying to finish an application essay for college scholarships. The house was finally quiet, and I'd spread my materials across the dining room table, really getting into the flow of writing about my goals and aspirations. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful about the future, imagining myself in a dorm room somewhere far away from all the drama. Ethan wandered into the dining room and immediately started commenting on my work. He picked up my rough drafts, making loud observations about my handwriting and asking intrusive questions about what I was writing. I politely asked him to give me some space, explaining that I needed to concentrate to get the essay finished. Instead of respecting my request, he started deliberately trying to distract me. He began humming loudly, then tapping his fingers on the table in an annoying rhythm. When I asked him to stop, he escalated to moving my papers around and pretending to accidentally bump into my chair. The whole thing felt like torture designed specifically to break my concentration. I moved to my bedroom to escape the harassment, but Ethan followed me. He stood in my doorway, continuing his campaign of deliberate irritation. He started making comments about how I'd probably never get into college anyway, how my essays were probably boring, how I wasn't smart enough for the schools I was applying to. Each word was chosen to hurt, delivered with fake concern that fooled no one. When I asked him to leave my room, he refused. When I tried to close the door, he stuck his foot in the way. The situation was escalating exactly the way it always did, with Ethan pushing boundaries until I reacted, then playing victim when I defended myself. But this time something was different. This time I had an idea. My phone was sitting on my desk and I casually reached over to start a voice recording. I didn't even think it through completely, it was more of an instinctive response, like my subconscious finally deciding it was time to collect evidence of what really happened during these confrontations. With the recording running, Ethan's behavior became even more outrageous. He started calling me names, really nasty ones that would have gotten him in serious trouble if our parents had heard them. He moved into my room without permission, picked up my belongings, and started making threats about what he'd do to my college applications if I didn't let him hang out in my space. When I continued to ask him politely to leave me alone, he raised the stakes. He walked over to my desk and deliberately knocked over my water bottle, sending liquid cascading across my keyboard and papers. Some of my scholarship application materials got soaked, and my laptop started making concerning noises as water seeped into the ports. That's when I finally snapped. I jumped up to save my laptop and shoved Ethan away from my desk, probably harder than I should have, but not hard enough to actually hurt him. I was frantic about my electronics and my applications, both of which represented months of work and my ticket out of this insane house. But Ethan had gotten exactly what he wanted. The moment I touched him, his entire demeanor changed. He let out this ear-piercing scream and threw himself backwards onto my bedroom floor, clutching his shoulder like I'd dislocated it. The crying started immediately, big heaving sobs that could probably be heard from space. Within seconds, both our parents were pounding up the stairs. They burst into my room to find Ethan on the floor wailing, me standing over him with my hands still dripping with water from trying to save my laptop, and scholarship papers scattered everywhere in various states of water damage. The scene looked exactly the way Ethan had planned it. I appeared to be the aggressor standing over my injured little brother, surrounded by evidence of some kind of violent outburst. Ethan, meanwhile, was the picture of innocent suffering, curled up on the floor with tears streaming down his face. Our mom immediately went to Ethan, helping him sit up and checking him over for injuries. Our dad turned to me with that familiar expression of disappointment and anger, already preparing to deliver another lecture about family responsibility and controlling my temper. The whole script was so predictable I could have recited it along with them. But this time I had something they didn't expect. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and stopped the recording. The file was almost 10 minutes long, capturing everything from Ethan's initial harassment to his fake injury performance. For the first time in my life, I had concrete proof of what really happened during our fights. The room went silent except for Ethan's continued sniffling. Our parents looked at my phone with confusion, not understanding why I was holding it like some kind of shield. I could feel my heart pounding as I realized I was about to cross a line that would change our family dynamics forever. Update 2. I played the recording right there in my bedroom with all of us crowded around my phone's tiny speaker. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but every word was clear enough to understand. You could hear Ethan's voice calling me horrible names, the sound of him deliberately knocking over my water bottle, his threats about destroying my college applications. Then came my voice, staying remarkably calm considering the circumstances, repeatedly asking him to leave me alone and give me space to work. The most damning part was the end, where you could hear the exact sequence of events. My careful words asking him to step away from my desk, the sound of water hitting the floor and my electronics, my panicked reaction trying to save my laptop, then the brief scuffle followed immediately by Ethan's theatrical screaming. But what made it truly devastating was what happened after his fake injury performance. While he was supposedly writhing in agony on my floor, you could hear him whisper to himself, just loud enough for the phone to pick up, "That should get her in trouble." He'd said it during a brief pause in his crying, probably thinking no one could hear him over his own sobs. The silence in my room after the recording ended was deafening. Our parents stood frozen, looking like they'd just watched their understanding of reality crumble in real time. Ethan had gone completely quiet, his injury act forgotten as he realized what had just happened. The color had drained from his face as he understood that his years of manipulation had finally been exposed. I expected our parents to be shocked, maybe apologetic, possibly angry at Ethan for his deception. What I didn't expect was for them to turn their anger on me first. Our dad's face went red as he demanded to know how long I'd been recording private family conversations. Our mom accused me of spying on my own brother, of violating trust, of being sneaky and manipulative. They were more upset about my surveillance than they were about years of false accusations and emotional abuse. It was like they'd completely missed the point of what the recording revealed, focusing instead on the fact that I'd gathered evidence without permission. The irony was staggering. I was being accused of deception and manipulation for documenting actual deception and manipulation. For about 20 minutes, they lectured me about privacy and trust while Ethan sat quietly in the corner, probably trying to figure out how to spin this new development in his favor. I felt like I was in some kind of alternate universe where recording the truth was worse than living a lie. The injustice of their reaction hit me harder than any of Ethan's individual schemes ever had. But then something shifted. Maybe it was seeing my complete devastation at their response, or maybe the reality of what they'd heard finally started to sink in. Our mom sat down heavily on my bed, her anger replaced by something that looked like exhaustion. Our dad stopped pacing and really looked at the water damage to my college materials, the destroyed laptop, the chaos of what should have been a simple afternoon of productive work. The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had ever happened in our house. For the first time in my memory, our parents started asking me direct questions about my experiences with Ethan. They wanted to know how often these situations happened, how long I'd felt unheard, whether there were other incidents they should know about. It was terrifying, to be honest, after so many years of having my truth dismissed, but I started talking. I told them about the destroyed homework, the broken projects, the countless times I'd been blamed for defending myself against unprovoked attacks. I described the anxiety of never knowing when the next false accusation would come, the way I'd started doubting my own memories and perceptions. What surprised me most was that they didn't seem completely shocked by these revelations. There was something in their expressions that suggested they'd suspected at least some of this was happening. When I asked them directly if they'd known Ethan was lying about our fights, the answer I got changed everything I thought I understood about my family. Our mom looked at our dad, and some kind of silent communication passed between them. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. They'd always known Ethan was exaggerating the situations, and they'd suspected he was often the instigator in our conflicts. They'd chosen to respond the way they did because they were afraid of damaging his self-esteem with consequences for his behavior. The logic was so twisted it took me several minutes to fully process it. They had knowingly allowed me to be blamed and punished for things I didn't do because they were worried that holding Ethan accountable might hurt his feelings. My emotional well-being, my sense of justice, my trust in my own family, all of that had been sacrificed to protect Ethan from the natural consequences of his choices. Our dad tried to explain their reasoning, talking about child development theories and birth order dynamics, about how they'd read that younger children sometimes act out for attention and that the best response was to avoid creating competition between siblings. They'd thought they were being good parents by not favoring me just because I was older and more mature. But their approach had created exactly the opposite of what they'd intended. Instead of preventing sibling rivalry, they created a situation where Ethan learned that manipulation and false victimhood were effective strategies for getting what he wanted. Instead of protecting his self-esteem, they'd enabled him to develop genuinely harmful behaviors that would probably cause problems in all his future relationships. And instead of teaching me valuable lessons about family loyalty and forgiveness, they taught me that truth didn't matter, that justice was conditional, and that the people who were supposed to protect me couldn't be trusted to care about my well-being. The most painful part of the conversation was realizing how unnecessary all of it had been. If they'd just responded to conflicts fairly from the beginning, addressing Ethan's behavior directly instead of letting me take the blame, we could have been a normal family with normal sibling dynamics. The years of resentment and anxiety I'd experienced were the result of their misguided attempt to manage our relationship through calculated unfairness. Ethan barely participated in this conversation, but I could see him processing the implications of what was happening. For the first time in his life, his usual tactics weren't working. Crying and playing victim had lost their power now that everyone understood it was an act. The dynamic that had defined our relationship for over a decade was crumbling in real time. Final update. The weeks following that recorded confrontation were unlike anything I'd ever experienced in our house. For the first time in my memory, there were actual consequences for Ethan's behavior. Our parents sat him down for multiple serious conversations about manipulation, lying, and taking responsibility for his actions. They made him apologize to me for specific incidents, and more importantly, they started treating our conflicts with actual fairness instead of their previous twisted logic. The change in Ethan was remarkable and disturbing at the same time. Without his arsenal of manipulation tactics, he seemed almost lost. He'd spent so many years getting his way through emotional manipulation that he'd never developed normal conflict resolution skills. Watching him try to navigate disagreements honestly was like watching someone learn to walk after years of relying on a wheelchair they didn't actually need. Our parents also made efforts to repair the damage they'd done to our relationship and to my sense of justice. They acknowledged that their approach had been harmful and unfair, and they started going out of their way to validate my experiences and feelings. It was healing in some ways, but also strange after so many years of invalidation. The most significant change was in how I felt about myself and my perceptions. Having concrete proof that I'd been right about the injustice I'd experienced was incredibly validating. The recording had given me back my sanity and my confidence in my own memory and judgment. I realized that I wasn't crazy or overly sensitive. I'd been responding normally to genuinely abnormal treatment. But the revelation about our parents' awareness of the situation created a different kind of wound. Knowing that they'd chosen to sacrifice my well-being for what they thought was Ethan's benefit felt like a betrayal that went deeper than anything Ethan had done. He was a kid using the tools he'd been given. They were adults who had consciously decided my suffering was acceptable collateral damage for their parenting philosophy. The family dynamic never completely returned to normal because normal had never actually existed in our house. We had to build new patterns of interaction from scratch, learning how to handle conflicts and disagreements in ways that were fair to everyone involved. It was awkward and sometimes tense, but it was honest in a way our family had never been before. Ethan and I developed something that wasn't exactly friendship, but wasn't the toxic dynamic we'd had before either. We learned to coexist without constant drama, and occasionally we even had moments that felt like genuine sibling bonding. He never fully acknowledged the extent of the damage his behavior had caused, but he stopped the worst of his manipulative tactics. The experience changed my relationship with technology and documentation in unexpected ways. I became someone who saved important text messages, who kept records of significant conversations, who understood the power of evidence in situations where truth was disputed. It wasn't paranoia, it was a practical adaptation to living in a world where people sometimes lie about reality. College applications became my escape route from the whole situation. The water damage to my original materials had been devastating, but I managed to reconstruct most of my scholarship applications. When acceptance letters started arriving, I chose a school that was far enough away to give me real independence but close enough that I could maintain relationships with my family if I wanted to. The distance was exactly what I needed. Being away from the daily dynamics of our house let me process everything that had happened and figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly defending myself against false accusations. I discovered that I was actually a pretty calm, reasonable person when I wasn't living in a constant state of injustice and hypervigilance. My relationship with my parents improved significantly once I wasn't living under their roof. Without the daily stress of managing Ethan's behavior and our conflicts, we could focus on rebuilding trust and connection. They continued to acknowledge their mistakes and seemed genuinely committed to doing better, both with me and with Ethan. The recording incident became family legend, referenced whenever we talked about honesty, fairness, or the importance of believing people when they tell you about their experiences. It was proof that sometimes you need evidence to make people see truth they don't want to acknowledge, even when that truth should have been obvious all along. Looking back, I realized that growing up in that environment taught me some valuable skills alongside the trauma. I became extremely good at reading people's motivations and detecting manipulation. I developed a strong sense of justice and fairness that served me well in relationships and professional situations. I learned to trust my own perceptions even when others tried to convince me I was wrong. But the most important lesson was about the power of documentation and evidence. In a world where people sometimes lie about reality, having proof of the truth can be the difference between sanity and gaslighting, between justice and continued abuse. That 10-minute recording didn't just resolve one family conflict, it gave me back my sense of reality and my confidence in my own experiences. The whole situation also taught me about the complexity of family dynamics and parenting. Our parents weren't evil people trying to hurt me, they were imperfect adults making misguided decisions based on flawed theories about child development. Understanding their motivations didn't excuse the harm they caused, but it helped me process the experience and eventually forgive them. Years later, when friends or colleagues find themselves in situations where they're being gaslit or falsely accused, I often think about that recording. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply document the truth and present it clearly. Reality has a way of speaking for itself when you give it a voice. The experience shaped how I approach conflict in all areas of my life. I learned to address problems directly rather than hoping they'll resolve themselves, to stand up for truth even when it's uncomfortable, and to trust my own perceptions even when others try to convince me I'm wrong. Those skills have served me well in every relationship and situation since then. Our family still isn't perfect, no family is. But we're honest now in a way we never were before. Conflicts get addressed directly instead of through manipulation and scapegoating. Everyone takes responsibility for their own behavior instead of blaming others for their reactions. It's not the family I grew up in, but it's the family we chose to become after facing the truth about who we'd been.